Vieta in Terra brings the latest scholarship in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We have great passion towards this interesting and often misunderstood time period. Please see the description below for ways where you can give even the smallest support. Can a monarchy be a republic? What if the Byzantine Empire was, in its own terms, a republic, such that the emperor ruled inside it rather than above it? This would mean that the Roman way of thinking about politics survived long after the republic itself was gone. The people we call Byzantines called themselves Romans, Rhomaioi. When they talked about power and public life, their key word was politeia, the shared civic sphere, the common business of the Roman people. In Latin, we call it res publica, the common affair. Crucially, in Roman usage, this term did not mean one particular regime type. Rather, it meant the collective affairs and common good of the Roman people, the public thing, no matter who sat at the top. That's our first step in flipping our expectations. A republic, in this Roman sense, could be governed by a monarch and still be a republic, so long as legitimacy flowed from the people and power served the common good. Roman authors said as much, and Byzantine writers inherited the semantics along with the institutions. Byzantium, then, did not constitute an exotic afterlife of Rome with theocratic politics. Rome's later phase saw its public sphere, the politeia, continue to authorize rulers and judge them by whether they benefited the Roman people. Modern writing has often mistaken court theology for the whole political picture, treating the emperor chiefly as God's viceroy and Byzantium as a theocracy. Anthony Caldelis shows why this picture paints an incomplete portrait. The imperial idea was a powerful rhetoric, but it sat on top of a political reality in which consent, popularity, and public interest made or unmade reigns. Theology explained victories after the fact, but it didn't cause them. Watching what emperors did and how they were made lets one see that the people keep coming into focus. New rulers weren't legitimate because a chronicler said heaven smiled on them. They were acclaimed in public ceremonies that claimed to represent a consensus of the Romans, what sources call the consensus universorum. That acclamation, an elevation before the crowd, was the seal of legitimacy, distinct from political maneuvers that produced a candidate. Inside the system, law itself acknowledged this public measure. Take Leo VI. In his novels, he calls laws the eyes and foundations of the politeia, but he routinely ratifies custom when society has already moved. If a rule no longer lived in the politeia, he could ostracize it. If a widely practiced custom served the common good, he could elevate it to law. In one striking formula, he essentially says, "Let it be part of the politeia now," which it already was before formal ratification. The people's practice had anticipated the statute. That tension is the point. The politeia is not a thin synonym for a state. It's the whole civic community of farmers, soldiers, clergy, artisans, and officials, all imagined as an organic body oriented to the common good, or tar koina. Law regulates that body, but the body's norms and interests also shape law. This is why politeia more or less is synonymous for res publica in Byzantine usage. The public's shared affairs, not a checklist of offices. Because the common good stood above mere formalism, even an emperor's lawful acts could be condemned if they harmed the politeia, and extra-legal acts could be praised if they plainly rescued it. The measuring stick that the Eastern Romans used to gauge emperors was not citing statutes or abstract laws, but whether he served the Roman people at large. Put all this together, and a different Byzantium comes into view. A monarchical republic where the emperor is of the Romans, his authority authorized and bounded by a public that could acclaim him, condemn him, and, in extremes, replace him. The court could still lace the story with theology, but in moments that mattered, consent, consensus, and the common good decided outcomes. When we use the word republic today, we usually mean a form of government without a monarch, comprising a representative system, elections, and offices limited by law. That modern meaning would have made little sense to the Romans themselves, and even less to their Byzantine heirs. For them, res publica in Latin, or politeia in Greek, did not name a regime type. It named the shared civic sphere, the common good, the public thing, the whole corporate life and affairs of the Roman people as a whole. The res publica was not a checklist of institutions, but the lived community of the Romans and their common concerns. Instead of asking whether institutions made up a republic or a monarchy, the Romans concerned themselves with whether an order served the common good of the politeia. Roman authors articulated this long before the emperors. Cicero's famous definition called the res publica the property of a people, res populi, a moral association bound by justice, and a partnership for the common advantage. The commonwealth is the people's affair, and a people is not just any gathering of humans assembled in whatever way, but an assemblage of the multitude bound together by agreement in law and by a partnership in advantage. From Cicero, De Re Publica Book 1 Chapter 39, from that premise, the essence of a republic lay in wherever the public was rightly ordered toward justice and the common good, such that the res publica prospered. Rome's res publica could in principle be administered by one, by few, or by many. Cicero explicitly allowed that kingship, aristocracy, or democracy could each be tolerable forms provided the public bond held and tyranny was avoided. Monarchy, then, was not inherently anti-republican in Roman usage. This distinction matters because it explains why Romans living under emperors did not experience themselves as post-republican. What we label empire, they could describe as a new phase of the same res publica, the commonwealth now administered by emperors rather than consuls. Caldelis stresses that Roman and Byzantine language treats res publica or politeia as the enduring political sphere grounding legitimacy in the people's ultimate sovereignty. Regime change altered administration, not the existence of the public thing. Ancient writers who mourned the old republic expressed a partisan, senatorial nostalgia. The same authors elsewhere still call the imperial order a res publica, while other historians like Velleius or Eutropius speak of a better republic, or simply use res publica overwhelmingly for the imperial period. The modern habit of using republic and empire as mutually exclusive regime labels is our anachronism, not theirs. The Byzantines inherited these conceptual semantics intact. In Greek, politeia had a long history, but by late antiquity, its dominant political meaning was the standard rendering of res publica as attested across legal, historical, and administrative texts and in bilingual materials. Greek terms such as to koinon, ta koina, ta politica pragmata, ta Rhomaioi, and related locutions carried the Roman semantic load as the Roman public's affairs, the Roman commonwealth, or the body of the politeia. By Justinian's age, politeia had become the default translation of res publica, and Byzantine usage mapped onto the Roman range of public administration, public property, political affairs, collective agency, and the common good. Two clarifications follow from this. First, Romans and Byzantines alike could, and did, distinguish the res publica itself from how it was governed. The empire did not abolish the res publica, only changed its mode of governance. Even Augustus' claim to restore the res publica makes sense against this background, whether or not contemporaries credited the rhetoric. Second, translating politeia as the state flattens the concept. Some court writers use narrower lenses and at times equate politeia with the machinery of rule, but Caldelis shows the larger, pervasive sense. The body politic as a whole, rulers and ruled together, the sphere in which laws, customs, and public interest interact, and the ruler is only one part. Caldelis's central methodological move is to restore this concept to our reading of Byzantine texts, where it is everywhere in evidence but has been effaced by modern assumptions. From here, the implications are plain. If the politeia is the Roman public's corporate life, then legitimacy is measured against the public. Power is justified when it serves the people's common good and is answerable to their ultimate judgment. These explain why Byzantine sources invest so much in acclamation and consensus as the seal on authority, and why legal projects from Justinian through Leo VI present the good of the politeia as the standard against which both laws and customs are assessed. Caldelis later emphasizes the critical nuance. Custom poses a strong normative claim, but is not legally binding without imperial ratification, an ambiguity that Leo VI makes explicit. Seen in this light, calling Byzantium a monarchical republic allows a strict recovery of Roman categories. A politeia, a res publica, governed by an emperor of the Romans, within the civic whole and for its advantage. The Byzantines did not parade the English word republic, but they did speak and act within the Roman framework of the politeia, the public thing. Some late antique writers even gave this republic a proper name, Rhomaioi, the community of Romans in its monarchic phase, the Roman people's shared civic order, whose welfare and consent authorize and bound the exercise of power. The new laws of Leo VI, or his novels, form one of the richest windows we have into the constitutional imagination of the Middle Byzantine world. Written around the turn of the 10th century, they were presented as routine legal supplements to the great codification projects of earlier emperors. But if we read them closely, they reveal something more radical. An emperor who understood himself as operating inside the politeia, the civic whole of the Roman people, and whose laws had to reckon with the will, practice, and judgment of that people. The preface to the novels sets the tone. Leo declares that he cannot neglect matters on which the good order and tranquility of the politeia depend. His task, he says, is to preserve harmony within the politeia by discerning which laws still live and which have withered away. Those statutes that foster justice and peace are to be confirmed. Those that have proven harmful or obsolete are to be exiled from the politeuma. At the same time, he promises to honor with the privileges of law the good customs already observed by the community. In a few compact sentences, the emperor articulates a constitutional principle. Law exists to serve the politeia, not the other way around. The politeia, as the public realm of the Romans, has an ongoing life that both precedes and outlasts particular decrees. This principle becomes explicit in Novel 1. There Leo acknowledges that customs and habits have normative weight, but adds a juridical qualification. No custom, however ancient, is legally binding unless it bears the stamp of imperial approval. In other words, custom carries the claim of law, but not its form until the emperor ratifies it. This delicate balance between recognizing popular practice and maintaining the emperor's role as legislator expresses the dual constitution of the politeia. One de facto, grounded in lived custom and consensus, and one de jure, formalized through imperial sanction. Throughout the novels, Leo dramatizes that tension in concrete ways. In some cases, he elevates custom above statute, stating outright that a current custom is better than an old law. Elsewhere, he concedes defeat when the people have already rejected a rule. An unworkable law is said to have been ostracized by the will of the people. Instead of denouncing this as rebellion, Leo recognizes it as a social verdict and formalizes it by repealing the law. One particularly revealing text ends with the formula, "Let this now be part of the politeia, which was already part of the politeia before this law." The emperor's decree thus confirms what society has already made real. The legislative act becomes retrospective, an acknowledgement, not an invention, of authority. There are also moments of struggle. Leo recalls how his father Basil had tried to revive an older statute, only to see the attempt collapse because people clung to the newer, more functional practice. Leo, more pragmatic, decides to regularize that custom instead of fighting it, even when he speaks in a paternal voice that laws are to citizens as a father to children. His practice is strikingly responsive to the lived behavior of his subjects. The emperor presents his decisions as leadership, but the subtext is negotiation. In the same texts, Leo calls laws the eyes, the foundations, and the leaders of the politeia. Yet by his own reasoning, Those eyes and foundations take their measure from the body they serve. Laws are instruments for sustaining the moral and civic health of the community, not sources of legitimacy in themselves. Across the novels, both written law and unwritten custom are judged by a higher criterion: usefulness to the politeia, the welfare and stability of the public whole. The emperor legislates with that end in view, but the standard itself lies beyond him. Caldeles reads this as a constitutional dialogue inherited from Roman jurisprudence. Classical jurists had already conceded that ancient custom has the force of law, and the Digest, later the Basilica, codified that principle. Custom was a form of social reason that could crystallize into law through recognition. Leo's insistence on imperial ratification keeps that tradition intact while giving it a republican twist. His measure acknowledges the people's creative role in shaping norms, even as it reserves for the emperor the formal act of endorsement. The political logic underneath is clear. The emperor is not a sovereign legislator standing above the public, acting only as the spokesman of the politeia, translating its lived order into legal speech. In practice, this meant that the ruler's authority oscillated between two poles: the people's customs, their consensus, their collective moral judgment, and the imperial office that gives that reality its juridical voice. Caldeles calls this a two-level constitution of the politeia. The emperor's decrees both derive from and confirm the people's will. Roman legal thought had long understood the danger of severing law from life. As one jurist put it, law is established by custom, not custom by law. In Byzantine terms, the politeia could not be maintained by mere fiat. Its norms had to align with what society recognized as just and beneficial. That is why, in Leo's rhetoric, laws are constantly weighed against the will of the people, the majority, or the totality of the Romans. His wording locates sovereignty within the body of citizens. The emperor's task is to articulate their sense of justice into the form of law. This is also why legality and legitimacy did not always coincide. Caldeles notes that Byzantine history is full of moments when the people acted outside the law to refound it, whether deposing tyrants, acclaiming new emperors, or overturning decrees. The same dynamic that allows custom to precede legislation also allows popular will to precede and reshape authority. Leo's novels make that dynamic visible in the domain of law. The politeia can anticipate the emperor, and the emperor's duty is to recognize and codify the moral order already alive within it. Read this way, the novels serve as a treatise on republican kingship. They present a vision of governance where the emperor's legislative power is both real and bounded. It is real because he alone can give custom the form of law, and it is bounded because his action must correspond to the people's welfare and consent. The politeia remains the prior reality, the living republic that endures beneath and beyond its monarchs. That, in essence, is what Leo's laws show us. Not a ruler imposing order from above, but a Roman emperor negotiating with the public he represents. Not a theocratic sovereign, but a magistrate of the politeia. The people are not a passive populace, but an active body whose customs and judgments define the space of lawful authority. Byzantium, in this legal mirror, appears again as what it called itself, the Roman politeia, a republic in which the emperor legislated under the gaze and by the consent of the Roman people. The core of Caldeles' argument is that sovereignty in Byzantium, as in Rome, ultimately resided in the people. The emperor governed, issued laws, and judged, but all these functions were carried out within a political order that the people constituted. The politeia, the body of Romans collectively, was the source of legitimate authority. It was the public sphere in which power was generated, transferred, and evaluated. The emperor ruled for the people, but his office existed through them. Byzantine sources routinely depict the people as a real political actor, one whose acclamation could validate or annul a reign. Roman political thought had long described the people as the origin of all authority. In republican theory, the populus Romanus was the ultimate legal person. Even when power was delegated to magistrates or to the emperor, It was understood as having been entrusted to them by the collective will of the Romans. Cicero's formulation of the res publica as a property of the people continued to define Roman legitimacy in imperial times. The emperor's title, Imperator Romanorum, always included a genitive of dependence. He was not a sovereign over the Romans, but an official of them. Byzantine usage preserves this language. The emperor is Basilius ton Rhomaioi, the emperor of the Romans, and the preposition ton signals that the people are the defining term in the relationship. Caldeles insists that this was not empty rhetoric. The Byzantines regarded the people as the collective subject of the politeia, and hence as the ultimate source of political legitimacy. The emperor's authority was valid only insofar as it reflected the consensus of the Romans, expressed in acclamation. Imperial elections did not exist in any formal sense, but every accession involved two distinct stages. First came the selection of a candidate, often the result of palace intrigues, military conspiracies, or dynastic succession. Second came the elevation and acclamation, the public ceremonies that enacted the people's consent. These were not ceremonial embellishments, they were constitutive acts of sovereignty. Sources describe this process in deliberate civic terms. During an elevation, the army or the populace gathered in the hippodrome, the forum, or before the great palace. The new ruler was presented on a shield, his name proclaimed, and the crowd cried that he is worthy. Chroniclers frequently note the number of times the people shouted or the way the cry spread through the city, because this moment marked the passage from private ambition to public authority. The term often used to summarize it is consensus universorum, the agreement of all. Without this consensus, no claim to the throne could be legitimate. The Byzantine chroniclers knew this well. When a coup failed, the narrative often emphasizes that the people did not consent. When a usurper succeeded, writers justified the event by noting that the Romans acclaimed him. The language of sovereignty thus persisted even in moments of violence. Rebellions and palace coups were presented not as arbitrary seizures of power, but as corrections of tyranny or restorations of justice carried out in the name of the politeia. To depose a ruler was to exercise the people's residual right of judgment. The same logic that gave legitimacy through acclamation also permitted its withdrawal through revolt or deposition. The result was a political system that could absorb turbulence without collapsing, because every change of ruler could be reframed as the republic acting through the people. Caldeles argues that this pattern is not a late invention, but a continuous feature of Roman political culture. The Roman populace was never formally abolished. Its functions were displaced into ritualized forms of consent. The acclamation of emperors replaced the assemblies of the Republican period, but it served the same conceptual role. Even when the army performed the first acclamation in the provinces, legitimacy remained incomplete until the population of Constantinople confirmed it. Only when the people of the capital gave their voice could an emperor claim to rule the Roman politeia. The chronicles and ceremonial texts are explicit about this dependency. They describe the city as the heart of the politeia, whose inhabitants represented the Roman people as a whole. When the crowd in the hippodrome acclaimed a new emperor, the acclamation was treated as a juridical act. Ceremonial manuals record formulae such as "the Romans have chosen you," or "we give our vote." Sephos. The Greek term sephos, meaning both vote and pebble, recalls the physical act of casting a ballot in ancient assemblies. Even if the practice had become symbolic, the concept remained alive. The people's shout was understood as a vote, a sign of collective approval that carried legal and moral force. This sovereignty, however, was not continuous. The Byzantines did not imagine a permanent assembly in session, but rather a dormant power that manifested itself in crucial moments. At a coronation, in a public uprising, or in the spontaneous acclaim that followed a successful revolt. In those moments, the politeia became visible. Sovereignty passed from its latent state in the community to its active expression in the people's voice. Caldeles likens this to a republican constitution, in which the people possess the highest authority, but delegate daily governance to magistrates. The emperor governs under that delegation, but he remains accountable to the body that empowered him. Byzantine political culture reinforced this understanding through the language of justice and public welfare. Imperial edicts, sermons, and historical narratives all measure rulers by the same criterion, whether they benefited the politeia. A good emperor was one who governed for the Romans. When emperors failed, by tyranny, fiscal oppression, or heresy, chroniclers and preachers depicted their downfall as the just retribution of the people's will. The moral economy of legitimacy thus tied sovereignty to public welfare. The people's consent was not a mystical abstraction, but a reflection of practical judgment about justice and utility. This conception also explains the coexistence of religious and civic idioms in Byzantine ideology. The emperor could be chosen by God, and yet still owe his authority to the consensus universorum. Divine favor was acknowledged, but it was mediated through the people's voice. The acclamation itself was sometimes described as inspired by God, so that the divine and civic dimensions of legitimacy merged. Caldeles reads this not as theocracy, but as political realism. Theology served to sanctify the verdict of the politeia, not to replace it. Thus the sovereignty of the people in Byzantium held both on paper and in practice. It held on paper because political thought and rhetoric continued to locate ultimate authority in the Roman people. It held in practice because rituals of acclamation and deposition made that authority visible in concrete acts. The emperor's power was always contingent on the recognition of the politeia, and every political change required the people's assent to become lawful. What followed was a monarchical republic, whose stability rested not on legal formalism, but on the recurring renewal of popular consent. For centuries, historians took the Byzantine Empire to be the ultimate theocracy, a state whose ruler reigned as God's viceroy on earth, governing a Christian people through divine sanction rather than political consent. That image of a sacred monarchy has dominated scholarship since the 19th century, when figures like Hergenrother and Ostrogorsky described Byzantium as an imperial church-state. Caldeles overturns this assumption at its foundation. The Byzantines certainly spoke the language of divine favor, but their actual political system, as revealed by law, ceremony, and narrative history, functioned according to secular and civic principles inherited from Rome. Theology was a secondary discourse layered over an older republican structure, not the engine that powered it. Byzantine sources that appear most theological on the surface, like panegyrics, coronation orations, and liturgical texts, are in fact the most circumscribed by genre. Court poets and bishops praising an emperor followed conventions that prescribed certain formulas. The emperor was chosen by God, crowned by Christ, or likened to David and Solomon. Such language merely played the role of ceremonial rhetoric, used to stabilize a volatile regime by framing its success as providential. Every new ruler had to retroactively justify his rise, and the claim of divine selection served that purpose. God had obviously favored the victor because he sat on the throne. The theological idiom explained what had already happened, but no one saw it as a theological cause. Outside of these formal texts, the picture changes. When one reads chronicles, military manuals, and legal prefaces that described how emperors were made and unmade, divine election recedes into the background. What determines legitimacy is not heavenly appointment, but popular acceptance, the consensus of Romans. The decisive acts are public acclamations, oaths of loyalty, and the recognition of the Senate and army. Even church writers often treat divine favor as a reflection of civic order rather than its source. For them, when the people are content, God blesses the reign. When tyranny provokes revolt, divine justice withdraws its protection. The theological narrative follows the civic one. Caldeles calls this underlying structure the secular republic. The term does not mean an atheistic state, but a political order in which legitimacy arises from human institutions and collective consent rather than divine revelation. In this republic, the emperor is the magistrate of a political body, the Roman politeia, whose laws, customs, and welfare define the boundaries of his power. Theology adorns the office with sanctity, yet the content of governance as taxation, justice, defense, and administration all remain squarely civic. The emperor must maintain public order, uphold law, and ensure the prosperity of the Romans. He undertakes political and moral duties, not priestly functions. The so-called imperial idea as the essence of Byzantine political thought was in reality mere rhetoric. It combined biblical imagery, Roman imperial titulature, and the language of divine providence to project stability in a system that was anything but stable. Byzantine politics were turbulent, playing host to coups, depositions, and civil wars throughout the empire's entire history. The imperial idea tried to suppress that instability by imagining the throne as a divinely anchored institution, unshakable even when individual rulers fell. Its purpose was to disguise the republic's volatility under a theology of permanence, though without invoking a permanent sacral kingship. The imperial idea's nature as consensus stabilizer thus becomes clear. A newly crowned ruler commissioned homilies and inscriptions that proclaimed him appointed by God. These were produced after his accession, sometimes within days, to sanctify a fact already achieved by human hands. When the same emperor lost power, those same circles would interpret his fall as divine punishment for injustice or impiety. The rhetoric was reversible because its function was apologetic. It converted political contingency into providential necessity. Caldeles therefore puts forward that Byzantine theocracy has been greatly exaggerated. The empire's political logic was not fundamentally different from that of late Republican or early imperial Rome. Sovereignty still lay with the Roman people, and the emperor governed under their authorization and for their benefit. Theologians and courtiers might speak of divine election, but the mechanisms of power, law, consent, and custom operated on secular principles. The church itself acknowledged this separation in practice. Patriarchs could crown or anoint an emperor, but they could not make one. They performed the ceremony only after the people and army had already acclaimed the new ruler. This pattern repeats across the centuries. In each succession, the same sequence unfolds: a seizure of power, public recognition, and then theological interpretation. The narrative order was always reversed. Theology came last but spoke as if it had come first. To modern eyes, this creates the illusion of a sacred monarchy. In context, it is the rhetoric of consolidation. The emperor rules not because he was divinely chosen, but because his rule has been accepted as legitimate by the community, and divine choice is the language used to describe that acceptance. What emerges from Caldeles' analysis is a dual structure of legitimacy. On one level, a sacred idiom frames imperial rule within salvation history. On another, more fundamental level, a secular logic of popular consent governs the transfer of power and the evaluation of rulers. The two coexist, but they are not co-equal. The second determines events. The first narrates them. The politeia continues to function as a civic republic whose head is a monarch. The imperial idea is the symbolic dress placed on that republic, not its constitution. Recognizing this distinction restores the Byzantines to their Roman inheritance. It shows that their political life was not an aberration, but the continuation of a Roman tradition in which the people's authority, the rule of law, and the common good were the ultimate criteria of legitimacy. The divine language of rule merely expressed that political structure in a Christian framework. Caldeles puts forward that the Byzantine politeia must be understood as a living civic organism composed of all those who took part in the life of the Roman community. The term politeia referred to the entire moral and social body of the Romans, not to the apparatus of rule that governed them. It included rulers and ruled alike, the emperor and the humblest citizen, bound together in the shared pursuit of the common good. To translate politeia simply as the state is to collapse that rich civic meaning into an anachronistic concept of government detached from society. Byzantine writers, following a tradition that stretched back to classical political philosophy and Roman legal thought, depicted the politeia as an organic whole whose parts had distinct functions but a single purpose. Soldiers, farmers, priests, craftsmen, and administrators were conceived as members of one civic body working for ta koina, the common things. This phrase carried deep resonance. It denoted not merely shared property or resources, but the collective life of the Romans, their laws, customs, moral expectations, and collective aims. The metaphor of the body was more than imagery. It expressed a theory of interdependence. The empire was not a machine run from above, but an organism in which all classes and occupations contributed to the maintenance of the politeia. In this conception, the emperor was not the soul of the organism, but one of its principal organs. He may perhaps have been the head of the body politic, but one that derived vitality from the rest of the body. Caldeles stresses that the Byzantine politeia was a civic community first, and a political institution second. The people, as the collective of Romans, remained the underlying reality from which imperial authority arose. Their customs and shared sense of justice gave the empire its coherence. When Leo VI or other emperors spoke of the good of the politeia, they referred to the welfare of this body as a whole, not to the interests of the court or administration. The literary and documentary record makes this collective vision visible. Legal prefaces and military manuals alike invoke the idea of a well-ordered politeia as the foundation of peace and strength. Treatises on agriculture, education, and moral conduct describe the contributions of different professions and social groups to the public good. Historians narrate political crises as illnesses in the civic body. Tyranny, corruption, or rebellion are diseases that threaten its harmony, and justice or reform are the remedies that restore its health. Such imagery expresses a civic theory in which the health of the politeia depends on cooperation and mutual accountability. This social totality also had an explicitly moral dimension. The Byzantine politeia was bound together by shared law and by the recognition of common norms. Justice, moderation, and charity were civic as well as spiritual virtues because they sustained the equilibrium of the whole. The emperor's role was to guard that equilibrium, not to define it arbitrarily. Law was understood as a means by which the community expressed its sense of justice and preserved its continuity. Custom, which grew from the habits of the people, stood alongside written statutes as another manifestation of the community's moral reason. Both law and custom were valued for the same reason. They maintained the proper order of the politeia and secured ta koina. In this respect, Byzantine civic thought remained deeply Roman. The semantic range of politeia in Greek mirrored that of res publica in Latin. Both terms could mean state, constitution, or commonwealth. But their most fundamental sense was the collective affairs of a people bound by law and mutual obligation. Greek terms such as to koinon, or the commonwealth, and ta politica pragmata, or public affairs, carried precisely the same meanings as their Latin counterparts. The Byzantines did not invent a new political framework, instead continuing the Roman one, translating it into Greek but preserving its civic substance. When a Byzantine writer used politeia, he was invoking a Roman conception of citizenship, justice, and the public good that had survived the transformation of the ancient world. This continuity of meaning has large implications. It means that Byzantine society understood itself not as a passive mass ruled by an external state, but as an active participant in a shared res publica. Every social stratum, from provincial farmers to urban elites, belonged to the same moral order. Their daily labors, taxes, and customs were not merely economic activities, but civic contributions. Even monastic and ecclesiastical communities, while set apart in spiritual vocation, were treated as parts of the same organism whose prayers and moral example benefited the whole. The politeia thus comprised both the secular and religious dimensions of life, joined by the principle that each component existed for the common good of all Romans. When Byzantine authors spoke of decline or reform, they did so in terms of the politeia's health. Corruption, injustice, and neglect of duty were civic maladies that weakened the body. Restoring justice and balance was a political healing. This moralized understanding of politics underscores how the Republic survived as a living ideal. The politeia thus served as a practical framework for understanding social reality. It shaped how rulers justified their actions and how subjects evaluated them. The emperor's legitimacy rested on his ability to maintain this equilibrium. By protecting the common welfare, respecting custom, and sustaining justice. By reading Byzantine texts through this lens, Kaldelis restores to them a meaning that modern translations have obscured. When Leo VI or a chronicler speaks of the public thing, they do not refer to a detached administrative bureaucracy, but to the collective moral community of the Romans. The empire was conceived as a politeia, a republic of interdependent citizens whose diverse labors sustained the common life. To understand Byzantium as the Roman politeia is to see it as a continuation of the ancient res publica, a civic order of farmers, soldiers, priests, artisans, and rulers striving to uphold ta koina, the common good that defined their shared identity as Romans. When we step back from modern distinctions between monarchy and republic, the long continuity of the Roman political tradition becomes visible. What historians call the Byzantine Empire was, in its own understanding, the Roman politeia still at work. The form of government had changed, but the underlying constitution remained that of a civic commonwealth. The politeia did not cease to exist with the rise of emperors. It adapted to a new shape, preserving the principle that the community of Romans was the ultimate source of authority and the measure of political legitimacy. For the Byzantines, this continuity was not theoretical. Their institutions, laws, and vocabulary all spoke of a res publica that endured. The emperor's title, the Senate's role, the language of acclamation, and the concept of the common good all trace their ancestry to Roman republican thought. What changed was the balance between ruler and people. The emperor now stood as the chief magistrate within the politeia, entrusted with administering the public's affairs, while the people retained the right to consent, to acclaim, and to judge. The political order remained dialogical, a constant negotiation between law and custom, between formal authority and public consensus. In many ways, this later Roman Republic proved more resilient than the senatorial republic of antiquity. The old system had been undone by faction, private interest, and the failure to reconcile the claims of the populace with the power of elites. The Byzantine politeia, though often turbulent, managed to sustain itself for 1,000 years. Its turbulence was not evidence of weakness, but of vitality, the continual self-correction of a society that still regarded public welfare as the test of legitimacy. Each deposition, each acclamation, and each legal reform represented the Republic in motion, adjusting itself to new circumstances while invoking the same civic ideal. This perspective also clarifies the role of theology in Byzantine political life. The language of divine election and providence was an interpretive layer placed upon political realities that were, in substance, civic and secular. The emperor's claim to be chosen by God became credible only after it had been ratified by the people's acclamation. Religious symbolism gave moral weight to events whose legitimacy still rested on the consent of the politeia. Theology served to explain success and justify continuity, but it did not determine who ruled or how power was exercised. Seeing Byzantium in this light restores the unity of Roman history. The politeia that governed the city of Rome continued to exist in Constantinople, translated into Greek and adapted to Christian civilization. Its structures of consent, its moral conception of law, and its sense of the public good endured. The empire was a monarchy in form, but in function it remained a republic governed through a throne. Law and custom interacted, consent confirmed authority, and the welfare of the Romans remained the measure of good rule. The picture that emerges is not of an exotic theocracy or a rigid autocracy, but of a Roman commonwealth that survived through transformation. The politeia authorized the emperor's power and judged its use. Legitimacy rested on public benefit, and the continuity of the republic was preserved through the cooperation, conflict, and consensus of its citizens. Byzantium, understood in its own terms, was Rome's later phase, a monarchical republic in which the civic tradition of the Roman res publica remained the living framework of political life.
Et semper rememorator, non omnes vagantes aberarunt.